Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Noon Bible Study with me. Today we are continuing on the series of How to Read the Bible, a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. So we're going to jump right in. We are in the dual books, the dual letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So let's jump right in. If you're in a group setting, and I know a lot of you use this as kind of a small group time to chat with some questions at the end, that's awesome. But take a minute and talk about what you already know about 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And join us in just a moment. For those of you watching online live, we're going to press right on ahead. I don't want you to miss the theme of Corinthians. The resurrection changes everything, and we say that around at the church, and I love how Paul takes the message of the resurrection and he applies it specifically toward a church setting. It's really, really powerful stuff. So let's jump in. Let's check it out. A little bit about the city of Corinth. Listen, it's a major port city. It's like one of the top 5 largest cities in the world at the time. It was rebuilt and reconstructed, maybe like a couple decades previous to Paul writing there. And so everything is new, right? Like a new neighborhood or a brand new city. I mean, everything has that new car smell to it. And so they were pretty affluent as a result of it. Paul spent about a year and a half getting to know the people that lived there. During that time, he was kind of recruiting people and talking to people about what this new church is going to look like, the church in Corinth. He eventually plants it and starts it. You can read a little bit more about that in Acts chapter 18. And listen, after a year and a half, he moves on, and he still thinks about them. He still no doubt prays for them. But then he gets word at like how they're doing. And honestly, guys, they're not doing all that well. He heard that the church in Corinth is plagued with like all kinds of these problems. So he writes a letter. Now, actually, he writes a lot of letters, and we have 2 of them, so we call them 1 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, right? We don't have all of the letters. There's kind of like references and allusions back and forth between them, but what we have, we just named 1 and 2. The first one, 1 Corinthians, has 5 main parts to it. He talks about divisions in the church. He talks about some sexual practices in the church. He talks about food. He talks about the gathering. And he talks, of course, about the resurrection. Now, it's interesting. Every time he talks about these practical applications, these practical matters in the church, he always does it by, number 1, describing what the problem is, and number 2, responding with the gospel. I just want to imagine what life would look like for all of us, what our families would look like, friendships, conversations, what our church relationships would look like if we did the same thing. If we described the problem and then we responded to the problem in the context of the gospel, specifically the resurrection. That's what Paul does. I think it makes a huge difference here. One of our takeaways is just going to be this recognition, guys, that we got to learn how to look at every part of life through the lens of the gospel, through the lens of the resurrection. It changes everything. And once we start seeing that again and again, it starts to pop out at us quite a bit more. Okay, and then 1 Corinthians wraps up. We're also going to talk about 2 Corinthians, which is probably not like the second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, but it's the second letter that we have. So 2 Corinthians is a good name for it. Probably more correspondence. When he kind of talks about these like divisions and all these practices that are kind of messed up in the church, listen, they didn't love hearing that. And so Paul has to respond with another letter, just acknowledging that they didn't really respond super well to the Corinthians, which probably gives us hope, right? Because our churches don't always respond as Christians. We don't always respond the way that we should to the gospel message either. So let's jump in and talk some of the structure of the books themselves. First, Corinthians 1 to 4, he's just talking about some of the divisions that are going on. There's all kinds of teachers, right? There's Apollos, there's Paul, there's Peter, there's more, and people are going, hey, I follow this guy, and they're like trying to pick the coolest and the wisest, the most articulate people they can to follow. Now, we kind of do the same thing, so we should probably dial it in, and pay attention to what he says. And Paul says, okay, cool, fun if you have your favorites, but remember what the church is about. We are not just picking leaders to follow. We are all actually following Jesus, right? He's ultimately our teacher. And so whether you follow this pastor or preacher or YouTube star, whoever it is, listen, notice the most important thing is that all of us are on this journey following after Jesus. That's what made the rabbi life of Jesus so significant, because he invites all of us to come and follow me, right? So we're not just following a different rabbi who follows somebody who follows somebody who follows Jesus. We're all following exactly in his footsteps. The church is not a popularity contest. We all gather around Jesus. Don't let the leaders divide us. And then he continues and says, okay, enough about the divisions in the church. Let's talk about sex. And so there's these shenanigans that are going on, right? One guy has this relationship going on with his stepmother, and that's weird. And then the other people are involved with the temple prostitutes. It's just like all kinds of messed up, right? And so he goes, we gotta address this, because some people are saying in the church, hey, listen, because we're forgiven and because we're in Christ, we're free to do whatever we want, right? And he's like, well, I mean, yes and no. Like, you're free, right? But listen, just because you're free doesn't mean you can do what you want without consequence of the harm that follows, right? That it still causes all this pain. It hurts all kinds of people, including ourselves. And when we mess up, when we make these mistakes. Plus, remember, Jesus died for our sin, and he takes it seriously. Let's not just throw ourselves around. And furthermore, remember, viewing everything through the practice of through the lens of the gospel, viewing everything through the resurrection lens is really important, because he's saying Jesus is raising our bodies from the dead. Now, what do we do? What we do with our bodies matters to him. Remember, we don't belong to just ourselves, guys. That is such a big point for this topic and for any topic. We don't belong to just ourselves. I mean, could you say something less American in this context, right? We don't belong to just ourselves. We belong to Jesus. And then he goes, now we're going to talk about food in 1 Corinthians 8, 10. It's not talking about like preference in food, but is interesting ethical dilemma about what to do with food sacrificed for idols. Do we eat it? Do we not eat it? He's like, I don't know. And he gives a couple scenarios, which is this interesting ethics dilemma, where he talks about the scenarios and goes, listen, if you're going to bite into something that was like sacrificed to idols and other people see you, and if they see you and think, oh, well, I guess because they bit into that, they worship Jesus, and they also apparently worship some other people too, then I guess you shouldn't eat it. He goes, stay away from that. But if people are not going to look at you, and if you're not going to lead somebody away from Jesus based on what you eat, then go ahead and eat it. So it's like the same action is taking place, but whether it makes it right or wrong is determined not by the action, but by some of the external circumstances. That's what makes it such an interesting ethical dilemma. Now, the core of the principle on everything he hits again and again in Corinthians is love. You've probably heard this passage referenced at a wedding sometime, that love is patient, love is kind. Love is the lens that we see this stuff through. Love is what motivated God to do what he did in the sacrifice on the cross. So we view our ethical lens of like what's right for me and what's wrong for me through what does love require of me? What would love have me do? What does the love of God compel me to do? That's going to be the deciding factor. And the same action might be right or wrong based on how you answer that question about what does love require of me. Okay, 1 Corinthians 11 to 14, let's talk about our gathering at church. What happens during that, I don't know, that encounter is roughly 60 minutes when people are worshiping together. Now, oh man, people are gathering, they're praying out loud in other languages. It's a little rowdy, it's a little boisterous. People are speaking other languages, they're confusing. Somebody might stand up and start talking. Somebody else is like talking over them, louder over them, because they have something that they want to say as well. I mean, it was confusing. It was super confusing, especially for guests. And so Paul says, okay, we need some order and some structure to the church. And he kind of says everything should be done decently and in good order. That's his kind of phrase there. And he wants it to be done, worship to be done, this gathering to be done in a unifying way. And he gives us the image, the picture of a body, like we're all different parts united in one body. And the highest value, again, is love. How do we love each other? And now Paul, he's like, I love praying and speaking in tongues in different languages. That's fantastic. But if it distracts people, I love this, especially at Encounter, especially guests. Listen, it can't be loving. If you're alienating the people that you're worshiping with, it isn't very loving, is it? So make sure that worship is done in a loving kind of way. It's really, really powerful stuff. And then this great passage, 1 Corinthians 15, all about the resurrection. Some people say, this resurrection thing is ridiculous. People don't rise from the dead. Right, exactly. That's the point. Jesus rose from the dead, and people don't typically do that. Some people didn't think that it was very important. Some people today still say, like, hey, maybe you can be a Christian or a believer and not totally believe in this resurrection thing. It's a little preposterous. Paul clarifies that and says, listen, everything hinges on the resurrection. Everything hinges. What about the hundreds of people who saw him rise from the dead? Plus, if he didn't rise, all of this, everything, absolutely meaningless. I mean, the resurrection compels us to do all of the things that we do. 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about the resurrection as victory over evil, especially death. The resurrection provides a source of life now and hope now. The resurrection provides the promise of future hope for the world, whether it's conversations around church structure, how that's done, food, sex, what we do with our bodies, finances in the book of 2 Corinthians, all of it is motivated by the resurrection. It's the literal reason we do everything that we do as Christians. You can't just not believe it and still call yourself a Christian. It's central. And then that message, like we heard, didn't exactly land well for the Corinthians. They didn't like to hear it. They didn't like Paul telling them to stop doing the things that they liked to do with their food, with their bodies, with their leadership, all of this sort of stuff. Divisions in the church, they wanted to keep being them. And so he has to write another letter called 2 Corinthians. And he addresses this tension that they don't really like him anymore. Really, because the Corinthians, remember, everything in their city had that new car smell. Everything was nice. Everybody had way more than they needed. They were extremely an affluent place. They despised Paul as a result of it. And they said he was often homeless, he was poor, he wasn't a very good public speaker. They loved good public speakers. Generally, Paul is an underwhelming kind of person. And so they liked some more impressive Christian leaders that they followed. Well, Paul shows that their rejection of him in these chapters is actually a rejection of the gospel. He's going, guys, you don't get it. Like how immature you are as Christians to reject me just because I don't kind of fit the affluent, rich stereotype that you have of somebody who's quote unquote successful. And so he talks about true Christian leadership is a servant kind of humble leadership. They wanted him to show some credentials, and he goes, credentials? Are you kidding me? You are my credentials. I started you, church in Corinth. I mean, for crying out loud, you're my church. You are my credential. And then he goes on to show how the cross really turns all of this upside down. It turns glory and turns suffering upside down. It inverts these two things, and how Paul is actually an embodiment of that, of the cross, of the shame and the suffering turned upside down into glory. And he's going, guys, don't you get how this resurrection thing works, how this Jesus thing works? And then he talks exactly about money and about generosity, and he levels it. He goes, so the context of the background here is that the Jerusalem church fell into a famine. They've fallen into some hard times. And he was taking a collection to help them out. And so he collected all this money from other churches that he started, except Corinth. The wealthiest church of them all in the wealthiest district didn't give anything. And so Paul is writing to them, and he's going, guys, listen, I went through Philippi. These guys are like dirt floor poor. I mean, they have got like nothing. Yet out of their generosity, they well up this gift to give to the Jerusalem church. He's like, you're being outdone by Philippi. This is embarrassing. But really, this isn't just about money at all. I mean, it's a sign that, like, I don't think you've actually been transformed by the gospel. Someone once said, your budget is a theological statement. I love that line. I've used it in the church budgeting world, in my own life, my personal budget. Your budget is a theological statement. And what he's saying is, like, I've seen your budget, church, Corinth, And what your personal budget show me is that God does not have a grip on your life. That was powerful stuff. And he tells it's sort of the gospel this time in a financial metaphor. Remember, resurrection changes everything. It changes how we deal with money. Though God is rich, he became poor so that you as poor could become spiritually rich. It's one of the lines that he gives. And then he talks about the heart of the conflict, hoping to resolve some of this. He sarcastically calls some of these troublemakers in the church super apostles, which I just love. And he names that they're causing all kinds of trouble and problems in the church. And he goes, oh, you want to compare some credentials with me and some of these super apostles you got going on? Awesome. Let's talk about knowledge of the Bible for just a second. And he goes, Paul, I memorized it. The literal whole thing, I memorized it. He says, I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. Like, you've got to be kidding me. Talk about credentials. I want to talk about spending time with Jesus, like Jesus and the Word. Paul's going, I met him on the road to Damascus. He kept reappearing in these. I've seen this vision of the throne room of God. I've spent time with the risen Jesus in a miraculous way. We'll talk about credentials here. I've given my entire life over for the sake of Jesus and his gospel. And plus, I've never asked you, Corinthians, I've never asked you, church in Corinth, for anything. I've never asked you for money. Unlike some of those other super apostles who charged you all these huge exorbitant fees in order to share their wisdom with you. That's not me, and that's not the gospel. Anyway, he doesn't boast because that's not the gospel. But he says if he was going to boast, he would boast in his weaknesses, because it's in his weaknesses that Jesus in his grace shines most. And then he just kind of ends it with this like, hey guys, check your hearts on this. Are you even a Christian? Are you a mature Christian? Does the gospel have any hold in your life whatsoever? Kind of food for thought. And that's sort of how it ends. The church in Corinth is not exactly like a feel-good kind of story. It's a cautionary tale in a huge extent, right? But the question isn't what happened to them. The question is what happens to us, what happens to you. Has the resurrection got a hold of your life? Do you view everything through the lens? Conflict, what we do with our bodies, what we do with our money, what we do with our conflicts. Do we deal with it all? Do we view it all through the lens of the resurrection and how that has changed everything? If you're looking for a key verse in the Corinthians, I'd recommend 1 Corinthians 15:14. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Everything hangs on the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. It's literally everything the reason why we do what we do in the church. All right, we can see that Jesus pops up in a lot of places in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. The resurrection impacts every single part of our life. Paul's letter applies the resurrection to these different areas, just to name a few. Divisions, finances, conflict resolution. How does the resurrection impact your life? It's a good question. It's a good question to carry with us throughout this week. I got some reflection questions going on. If you're in a study by yourself, that'd be a pretty cool way to just sit with God during a lunch break and just to ask him what we learned, what we took away from this study in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out. I'm glad we can spend the time together. I'm going to leave the questions on the screen for just a little bit before we take off. And we'll see you next week, Wednesday at noon, to continue our study. Take care.